Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 144. Today's guest is Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today on Keep the Channel Open, I'm talking with writer Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Gerardo Sámano Córdova is a writer and artist from Mexico City. He holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Michigan. He has studied with Alexander Chee at Breadloaf as a work-study scholar and with Garth Greenwell at Tin House. He has received the Tyson Prize for Fiction, some Hopwood Awards for novel, short fiction, and drama, and was a finalist for the Henfield Award in fiction. His work has appeared in Ninth Letter, Passages North, Chicago Quarterly Review, and The Common. Monstrilio is his debut novel, and it's that debut novel that we're discussing today. Now, one thing to know about Monstrilio is that it opens with a child's death, and that is by no means a spoiler. The very first line of the book is, "Her son dies in a child-sized bed, big enough for him, but barely enough to hold her and her husband, who cling to the edges, folding themselves small so they fit one on each side of him." And so, as you can imagine, this is very much a story about grief. But, as you'll hear me say to Gerardo in our conversation, Monstrilio isn't like any other story I can think of reading before. In the first chapter, the mother, Magos, cuts a piece of her dead son's lung out of his body and puts it in a jar, where she feeds it broth until eventually it comes alive. The lung becomes the title character, Monstrilio, and eventually comes to look like the son who dies in that first line. But this doppelganger is different from the boy, not least because of his desire to, well, eat people. The story draws on both horror and literary fiction traditions, as well as the strong tradition of surrealism in Latin American fiction, and it makes for something unique. It's sometimes grotesque or horrifying, but nevertheless, it's also a hauntingly beautiful story about family and grief and self-acceptance. The narrative is complex, providing 4 different viewpoints into the story, and yet it is also compulsively readable. I had trouble putting it down. So, as you can imagine, I was very pleased to get the chance to talk to Gerardo about his book. A couple of notes before we get started. As always, there are links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of today's book. Gerardo chose Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, New York as his independent bookstore to highlight, so there's a link to order from there. There are also links to Mysterious Galaxy here in San Diego and to bookshop.org, but, as always, I highly recommend ordering from your own local independent bookstore. Finally, if you enjoy today's conversation, and especially if you've been listening to Keep the Channel Open for a while, I would so appreciate it if you'd share it. A quick shout out of today's episode on social media or telling the book lovers and podcast lovers you know about it. That sort of thing makes a huge difference for an independent one-man show like this one, so thanks in advance. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Before I say anything else, I wanted to just say that this book was really interesting to me. I really enjoyed it. And it's not quite like anything I've ever read before. I imagine you've probably heard that a lot at this point.
Yeah, a little bit.
And one thing that I think, before diving into like the specifics of the characters or plot or things like that, I wanted to sort of back up a little bit and talk about genre.
Yeah.
So this is a topic that you've talked about in other interviews before. For example, when you were talking to Paul Semmel,
right,
one of the things that you said, is that this book is not straight up horror. It's also not a straight up family drama.
Right.
And when you were talking with Kelly Link, you talked a bit about melodrama. And
yep,
I'm going to come back to that a little bit. But one of the things that you said in that interview that I thought was really interesting is how it's a genre that has a lot of potential to be interesting. Not everybody does it well. That's obviously true of any genre.
Right.
But what I'm interested in here is like how you think of this book in relation to the horror genre sort of broadly, like whether you feel like this is an example of like you're trying to just do an example of horror well, or whether you're trying to sort of work across the genre, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. So I don't think the book is an example of just pure horror. And I think a lot of people have said that about the book, that it's not like what they expect from a horror book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it has to do with, in horror, you expect certain thrills and chills and all of that. And I'm not sure this book delivers that completely. It's more using horror elements to tell a story. And so I wouldn't categorize it as just pure horror, because it would do a disservice both to horror and the book. Because I think there's also like a great thing about going into like a purely horror piece and just knowing what you'll expect. There's a satisfaction in knowing that you'll encounter something that you already know that you like, and there's value in that. But also I think there's value in like kind of like questioning or using and like engaging certain tropes and certain ideas in different ways. And so I think both have a place to exist in the world. So in this book, primarily I'm more interested in using horror elements to tell the story that I wanted to tell, because I am interested in the idea of horror bringing those more primal emotions in a reader, in an audience, but not necessarily just being the ride, like a horror ride. So there's both of those things going on, right? When I started it, I didn't even think it was going to be like a horror piece. But then as I started talking more about like when it was getting more complete and all of these things, when you start to get into like the more of like the publishing and marketing and all of that, the word horror started to be more abundant. And so I thought a lot about what it meant for the book to be marketed as horror, and how that would engage with horror audiences and with like people, and also with people that kind of like detest horror, like just because if something's labeled horror, they're like, well, I'm just not going to engage with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a little bit wary about how it would be received, because it's not, like I said, it's not traditional horror or like pure horror. But I think some of the people that have received it the best are like the horror fans, who have said that it's not pure horror, but at the same time, they're like very into the book just because of what it brings. And so I really enjoy that part of the process. And so it's been a lot of learning for me also, and what it means to put out a piece of work that has like a label on it and it not fit within that label fully, which is kind of like what every person experiences, and also kind of like a theme of the book. But it's been an experience, and it's been a mostly positive experience, just to see that people are actually willing to just like be open and just embrace things, even if they don't conform to what they expected.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about the way that the marketing side of things plays so well into the themes of the book about sort of what you're supposed to be. But
Right.
that is really interesting. I think, if I'm remembering right, that on the publisher's website, it's actually listed as literary fiction. But the fact that it's using these horror tropes, I think I don't know how, like where Barnes and Noble, for example, would shelve it. But
yeah, it's mostly shelved under horror sections everywhere that you go, mostly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this thing that you were talking about the reader expectation, that was actually sort of the next thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because obviously familiarity with genre tropes is, in a lot of ways, it's that familiarity that brings genre readers back to the genre over and over again, right?
Right.
That all of these books that make up the sort of body of a genre are in conversation with each other in some way or another. And
Right.
one of the things I was thinking about genre expectation is, many years ago, I used to be on this listserv that was for fans of Gene Wolfe's books. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No, I'm not familiar.
So he's sort of like a literary science fiction writer.
Okay.
And one of the things they were talking about was where the discursive energy of a genre operates, and how, for example, if you were to encounter the sentence, "He turned on his right side," If you were reading a sort of contemporary realist story, you'd be imagining somebody like turning over in bed. But if you're reading a science fiction story, you might imagine like a robot or a cyborg or something, like actually activating one side of his body.
Right.
And how that changes, even on just a sentence level, how the genre expectations change how we understand what's being said.
Right, exactly.
And so you were talking just now about reader expectation and perhaps a little bit of trepidation about it, but also it seems like this is a really powerful tool for an author. And so I was wondering, like, to what extent were you, when in the writing of it, considering utilizing those reader expectations in sort of, creating the impact or the meaning in this work? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started writing, I think I considered them less, but it was definitely in the revision process, especially like more towards the end of the revision, I guess, when you're really like tightening up the screws and everything, like it's more shapely and like it has a little bit more of propulsion and energy and all of that. And especially like to bring energy into the parts where there was a lack of it, I really turned back into thinking about those horror ideas or suspenseful ideas and how like certain narratives do those, and see if I could infuse that into my book as well. So those tropes or those ideas of what people would expect actually like helped me a lot to kind of think of other ways of writing a scene or moving from one idea to the next. So it kind of like simplified it a little bit, because sometimes I feel, well, at least I do, you just want to like go to the extra level, or like, like you think like everything should be super profound or mind breaking or something like that. But sometimes you just, there's so many tools out there already that work really well. And just to go back to those and kind of like see and be like, yeah, I can use that. And I think it also takes a little bit of humility to be like, well, people have done this well for ages. Why not, adopt some of those ideas and see how they can help my writing, instead of thinking that, like I'm this unique writer that needs to know nothing about anything, like everything, like I can do everything by myself. But there's this huge tradition of like, especially in any genre, in any art form, there's history and there's like a lot of people that have done things really well. So going back and like being like, oh, that works, I think that helped me a lot.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting. There has been, I think, a bit of a trend in literary fiction over the past maybe 10 years or so of incorporating different fantastic elements into what would otherwise be considered a literary story.
Right.
It's been really interesting to watch the sort of dialogue in different communities, different reader communities play out,
right,
responding to that. And I have found oftentimes that genre readers who come to these more fantastic or perhaps surrealist literary fiction works
right,
will often have a certain disdain in terms of like, you get the sense that the author believes that they're inventing something, that this has never been done before. Whereas the genre reader knows, well, actually, people have been doing this for as long as this genre has existed. So,
exactly.
And I really felt like in this story that there is this respect for the genres that it touches against or overlaps with. Right. I think that you really get a feel for, this is a writer who isn't looking down his nose.
Well, I'm glad, because I really tried hard not to, like, it was very important for me to respect something, especially because I felt and I still feel like I'm new, I haven't written in that tradition. I mean, like, I'm a new author And so I want to respect what has come before me and like to put out something into the world that shows respect to what has been there before in all like the different genres or even like literature in general. Not to be arrogant and be like, well, this is the new thing that's coming and it's gonna like destroy everything else, but rather contributing. So yeah, I'm glad that that happened.
Yeah, I found as a reader that, you know, I don't have a ton of experience reading horror. I've read some, but it's not sort of one of my main genres.
Right.
But I did find that because of the way that this book was sort of pitched to me as a literary horror novel,
right,
it affected sort of, you know, as a reader, when you're reading a story, you kind of can't help but have a certain anticipation of, you know, what's coming around the corner kind of thing.
Right.
And genre informs a lot of that. I thought a lot after I was finished reading this book about, I can't remember who it was, but I remember reading a Craft article once about horror writing and how there are these three distinct emotional responses that you get as a horror reader. And I believe the way that it was broken down was dread, which is sort of like an anticipation of something scary happening.
Right.
Terror, which is like the sort of feeling, the like really heightened fight or flight kind of response that you get when something scary is in the process of happening. Right. And then horror, which is sort of like looking back on what actually has just happened kind of thing.
Right. Like three phases.
Right.
In time.
And what I found when I was reading this book is that there was a lot of dread in those terms where I would, because especially I think in the early portions of the book, when you're sort of being introduced to Monstrilio as this sort of animal kind of, you know, you're not sure what's going to happen.
Right.
Right. That thinking of it as like, well, this is a horror novel, then I'm expecting some kind of a jump scare. Right. And this book doesn't really do that, but it was really interesting to consider how the expectation that that could happen at any moment sort of sets up a certain tension at least that was my experience as a reader.
Right.
And I just wonder if sort of hearing that sort of sparks anything for you.
Well, I mean, the dread is definitely something that I did consciously because I think the dread is always there. The book begins with a death, and that is dreadful. But so now, like the rest of the book is this new creature that they're not sure what or who he is. And so that dread is constantly there. And also the dread that what happens in the beginning of the book could happen again, maybe that horrible loss. And so I think that like emotionally was always present was writing. And the jump scare part, it just never, like I thought about it in some parts, where I was like, well, maybe I could try, you know, going that route of like something happens that, you know, like you move to the next phase, right? Like how you were saying, like from dread to terror, but it never really happened organically, at least in my experience, just because you kind of always know you're intimate with Monstrilio in a way. And the people that surround him are too. So even though he does unexpected things, I didn't think like the payoff would be just like a scare. For me, was more exploring how to stretch the love that the people around him feel for him and to test if it could break and if it would break. And I think like just being scared of Monstrilio all the time and like just like waiting for him to like attack or like to scare you in some way would not benefit what I was trying to do with the story. And so, yeah, I think the dread is definitely there. And I think maybe the horror of what he has done. But in the end, I wanted to write about love, which is weird because we talk so much about horror. But actually, like I wanted to write a book about love and like how it can stretch and if it can or cannot break, you know?
Yeah. I found that, there were a couple points, especially sort of early in the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, when we first really see Monstrilio as like something that can move around, right? The first scene where it's not just a lung in a jar, right?
Right.
Where Lena and Magos are have sort of cornered him in a closet. And
right.
It's such a classic sort of horror movie trope of like, you're like bending down to look under the bed and something is going to jump out at you.
Yeah.
And that is not what happens. And what I found for myself is that the fact that expectation was sort of redirected, right?
Right.
It goes in a different direction. That sort of gap between the expectation and the reality, it was really where a lot of the interest for me, especially in the early scenes of this book, where that really comes in and makes it actually more, like there's this question that you have, was like, this isn't how it's supposed to work out. So why is this person behaving this way? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that. I don't know how consciously I did it at that moment, but I think there's also like this idea that when you're reading a book early on, you start setting the expectations about what the book will and could be. And obviously you can revert those expectations or fulfill them. But I think a lot of what I wanted to do in this book is not to do the unexpected just because it's unexpected, but because Monstrilio is this embodiment of something that you don't know exactly what he is, and he cannot be like boxed into a particular label or category. And so I wanted the book's form and pages also to reflect that. And so when people react in certain ways, I was conscious of them reacting in ways that maybe are not super conventional, but also not in like just bananas ways that just would put a reader off, and would be like, well, this makes no sense at all.
Right.
So it was kind of like a balance that I was trying to do for those two things, because they're also like put into a situation where there is no precedent, at least for the characters in the book. None of them have experienced this either. And so we don't know how any of us would react. And so I tried for the characters to react in ways that seemed appropriate for them and like true and honest more than anything else.
So then, like, one more thing just on genre.
Yeah.
So something that you wrote an essay for Crime Reads,
right?
And you touched on some of these things as well when you were talking with Kelly Link,
right,
for that for a literati bookstore,
right?
About this comparison that you make between the genre of horror and the genre of melodrama. When you're talking with Kelly Link, you also mentioned pornography and how these genres are sort of maligned, which it was fascinating to hear, when I was researching to talk to you, to see you bring this up, because just a couple of weeks ago, I went to a book event for Chuck Tingle. Do you know who Chuck Tingle is?
Yeah.
And
the guy with the bag on his head.
Yeah.
He's
surprisingly articulate and really well thought out, the things that he thinks about genre. And he gave this presentation at his book event where he was talking about what he calls the trinity of maligned genres. And for him, it's horror, erotica, and comedy, and how people don't see these as like a site of serious literature, because exactly as you were saying in your essay, because the reaction that you get is not an intellectual one. It is one that happens in your body.
Yeah. And
I thought that was really interesting. But another thing that I wasn't really sure, I felt like you were kind of touching on it a little bit when you were talking with Kelly Link, but I wanted to explore a little bit, is how also the genre of melodrama, certainly, and to some extent, I think also horror, are kind of a feminized genre. They're kind of seen as like, these are things that primarily women are interested in or aimed at women, and how that is also something that plays into how we think about these genres. You
Right.
mentioned when you were talking with Kelly Link about, stoicism as being presented as this sort of default kind of thing. And that's obviously a very masculinized
Right.
sort of cultural idea as well. And
Right.
so the fact that in this story, we get point of view characters, we get a really close point of view on two women who are very different from each other. And then basically everybody in the story is queer in
Right.
one way or another.
Right.
And how that is also something that kind of plays into things like melodrama and horror.
Yeah.
Especially horror being a genre both in film and in literature that is so often linked to sexuality,
Yep.
Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, well, there's so much to talk about there. And I mean, I'm very touched that you heard me speak to all these people and read those interviews and listened to me. I mean, thank you so much. But yeah, so for me, I mean, it's very interesting because, so I'll just back up a little bit. So when I wanted to be an artist, or like when I started like dabbling in art, like when I was young, like a teenager, I started writing, but then I went into film, and I love film, and I actually did my undergrad on film and photography. And so for me, books and films have been always intertwined, and what I learned from one, I learned from the other as well. Obviously, there's things particular to each practice, but inside me, like, it all feeds me together, and visual art too, and all of those things. And so horror and these genres are also very prevalent in film, right? And and I think film also started together with like artistic like inclinations to see what film could do artistically. It also like went hand in hand with entertainment. So it like kind of like developed together in a way, which is very interesting because it was also like a technological novelty. And so it did have like a starting point, right? And so to me, that's very interesting because film kind of like has this birth of being both entertainment and art at the same time. And so it kind of like walks that fine line always. And genres, how we discuss them in literature, usually when we say something is genre, we like think it's more for entertainment purposes. And when we say something is literary, it's more for artistic purposes. And so those things for me don't necessarily have to be like boxed away from each other. I think art can be entertaining and entertainment can be art as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be entertaining, or it doesn't necessarily need to be art, but those two things can and often do merge. And so when we talk about horror or these other genres like melodrama or pornography or like even comedy, like Chuck Tingle said, those things we usually relegate to something lesser because we feel things, and feeling is not intellectual and feeling is not art, right? So, which is weird because I think that idea of like art having to be intellectual is more new than before. Like art centuries ago, it would be something that you could feel, like you appreciate with your senses, because also it had to do a lot with the divine, right? And so you had to like move away from intellect and like kind of like experience divinity. And so I think horror and melodrama and like pornography and all of those things that bring like maybe what we consider base emotions can also help bring us closer to divinity in a way. And because once everything is absolutely filtered through the mind, I think a lot is lost. And so if everything is rational and if everything is just like processed through critique and through, like just giving answers to everything, like rational answers to everything, you lose a lot of things. And so when you disallow to experience art in also like an emotional way that you cannot put into words, you're forgetting a big part of what I think art can and does do. And so when you think about genres that kind of like traditionally bring out more base emotions, as we call them, like terror or sadness as in melodrama, or horniness as in pornography or erotica, or laughter as in comedy, we kind of like push them away because we think that's just not good. That's just like pressing buttons on the human and make them do something. But I think there's something very important about something that can make you cry or laugh or be scared. And also, in the second part of this long answer, it's these genres have also been in like the negative side of the coin, gendered in a lot of nasty ways. And so when these genres, especially through film, when they became much more popular, except for like the romantic novel, which was already popular and all those things, or the melodrama, but when it just reached a larger audience, these things were usually like gendered in a way. So like horror, I feel like a lot of horror things were done for men, or like young men, or well, not necessarily young, but like just in that instinctual way of like having fun being scared. And that's why there's a lot of like misogynistic horror, because it's like the way that male authors could enjoy horror was if like women were the victims, because that was the way that horror could be imagined without it like actually like causing true horror in their male audiences. And so if like the women were the victims, then horror could exist in that entertainment bubble without like causing actual horror. And so that's why we get all these serial killers or monsters that end up like killing women, or like the women, even if they survive at the end, like the final girls, they're always the ones being tortured, right? And I think that's why horror can be such like a powerful tool too, because now people of color, people of like women and different genders, like you can use horror because it has all that potential to like really reach into like a primal state, using those ideas without that racist or misogynistic and all those things that had been put into the horror genre in the past, right? And so all these other genres have those stereotypes as well, and all those layers of like who got to write those, who got to create those genres in those times, and how it's being subverted now, right? And so I think a lot of people also kind of discount genre because of these things. Like you expect, for example, a horror movie to have all these perhaps sexist or racist overtones, but then when a creator that wasn't like being able to create before, or heard, or like had the opportunity to have their work be seen by more people, when you have that opportunity, you get like amazing horror and amazing melodramas and amazing comedy and all of those things, And so I think just having these ideas and like understanding where they come from, who created them, and also knowing, like trying to like dig in and try to discover their value, or like what they can bring to the table, I think is something that I'm very passionate about and like just think a lot about. Because also, like, I guess I was disenchanted with realism. Also because when I grew up, I thought like literature was fantastic in some ways, just because a lot of Latin American writers that I read, they all had like fantastical elements. And so like for me, just coming from that tradition, just makes me want to explore it more and just kind of like sift through what it can bring and and I like the burdens it carries, and trying to like decipher all of that.
Yeah. Something that I find so interesting is how the monster of a horror movie, especially movies, I find, are so tied to sexuality, sexual appetite, whether that's, like somebody like Bela Lugosi's Dracula being just such a iconically scary, but also kind of weirdly sexual figure,
Right. Yeah.
How the horror genre really, especially in movies, really punishes any expression of sexuality, whether that especially like female sexuality or queer sexuality. Like if you're a woman or a gay person in a horror movie and you have sex, like you're gonna die.
Yeah,
right?
basically. Yep.
Yeah. And so working against that, it seems like such a fertile ground to be working in if you want to subvert those ideas. I think that this book, sort of moving away from genre and just getting into the specifics of this book, I feel like one of the really central things about this book is this question of monstrosity and what is a monster, what makes a monster. Obviously, the title character, Monstrilio, although that he does develop into something human-shaped, and I think that the question of whether or not he's a person is less... That's not like up for argument for me because of the fact that we see from his perspective, we know that he has thoughts and feelings. He's very obviously a person. That's to me more interesting than whether or not he's human, right?
Right.
But the question of whether he is a monster, I mean, so Monstrilio, he eats people, right? And that happens from the beginning of the book where before he's human shaped, he attacks a dog and he attacks Magos's mother, right?
Right.
And so the fact that we get to see things from his personal perspective later in the book certainly brings into question, is he actually a monster? What does that mean for him to be a monster? But I feel like it's more than just him, because I feel like every character in this book has some relationship to this question, right? Like early in the book, in the very opening sort of chapter that's not even in the first part of the book, right? It precedes the first part of the book.
Right.
Where immediately Santiago dies in the first sentence of the book. And one of the things that happens immediately is that, there's this brief description of immediate grief, but then Magos sort of shepherds Joseph out of the room and then cuts open Santiago's body, and not just carves out the piece of lung that later becomes Monstrilio, but also like licks the blood up, for example. And later on in the first few chapters of the first part, we have Joseph literally calling her a demon, literally calling her a monster. She's like, in the same sentence, he called me a monster and asked me to hold him.
Right.
Later on, we have a really interesting thing where when Magos's mother is in her relationship to Lena, there's this observation that Magos makes where she thinks like her mother thinks of Lena as the one person who deserved me, the one person perhaps who I wouldn't ever swallow whole, which when the first time you read it, to me at least, is like talking about, just a relationship dynamic. But, in contrast and in juxtaposition with this figure who literally does swallow people whole, Lena herself, her mother thinks that she's a demon. And Joseph, even though he's presented in sort of more of a normie kind of way, I guess, like even him, right? Like the ways in which he sort of stifles his child figure, or the way that he is in his relationship with Peter later on, and how you could make the argument, I think, that there are monstrous aspects to those dynamics as well.
Right.
So I feel like this question of what is monstrous is so central to not just the overarching plot, but like to each individual character, where we spend some time with this idea. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love the way that you put it, because I think it's true. And it's definitely like a question I had in my mind the whole time. And it's a question I definitely didn't want to answer. And it's a question I can't answer, really. And I think that's also part of what drew me to writing this book, was kind of questioning who is a monster and who gets to like define who a monster is or call someone a monster, and if there's such a thing, right? And also like how M like would think himself as a monster or not, and whether he would even think of that if he didn't have like other people telling him that he might, or that what he's doing is wrong. And so all those questions were in my mind, and it was definitely a conscious choice to try not to like answer them, but also have the central monster figure, which is Monstrilio, and even like the name says it, but to have like the people around him also like display these questions and these insecurities, whether they're like monstrous or not, or how they can like relate to it, you know? I think when we're young and we grow up, we're taught certain things are bad and certain things are good, and we kind of like form our own ideas of the world that way, what we want ourselves to be in the world, and what limits we allow ourselves to cross and which limits we will never cross. Or, you know, we constantly have those narratives within us. And then things change and things are tested, and our own ideas and moralities tested. And so I wanted to explore how that would look within a family and within like people who actually love each other. And so I'm kind of weary of like very strict parameters in anything. They make me uneasy. Maybe also because being like a queer person, anything that for me that like seems rigid almost seems like I'm not going to be a part of it. Because I guess like any rigid doctrine that I grew up with never allowed for queerness. And so I think rigidity in that, or like in your values and things like that, just gives me pause, personally. Like when I find like someone that's like very rigid in many of their beliefs, that just gives me pause, and I kind of like tend to put distance from that, just because it just makes me afraid that anything outside of those values will just break the relationship, or like there's like a potential for hurt there. So the characters kind of like came out in the book in a way that they're more fluid, not only in their sexuality, but in the way that they look at the world, and they're kind of like just taking it as it is, and they're kind of like fumbling, but also like they're trying to do their best, but a lot of the times they just like make mistakes. And so I wanted to create that world where like ambiguity and grayness and like these more fluid ideas and like sense of self can be more fluid, because I think that's also like a vision of the world that I feel more comfortable in.
Yeah. I think that this idea of, you know, not necessarily answering the question, like here's a question, you know, what does it mean to be a monster? And you're saying, you don't know if that's a question you can answer. And obviously, I mean, it's like that is a sort of, as a philosophical question, is something that humanity has been probably wrestling with and asking ourselves for,
right,
you know, thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
And I definitely think that in terms of art, right, that having a work of art presents something with a really nicely tied up and here's the answer, right? It feels very didactic. It feels very heavy-handed and pat. It also feels overly moralistic, especially in a question like this.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't get the sense that this is a question about which either the book itself or the author, you, has no point of view about, right? It's not that like this question is not being presented in a way where it's like, well, you know, just, you know, whatever anybody thinks is fine. It's like there is, I think, the fact that the book goes to such lengths to present these characters as complex.
Right.
And that each of them has something about them that is mysterious, you know, or, you know, like I've heard you talk before about how you really love the character of Magos. I would imagine that there are a lot of readers who don't, right?
Yeah, a lot.
And of course, a big part of that is going to just be because she's a woman, right? And she doesn't behave in sort of the like traditional like ways that we expect from femininity.
Right.
And yet she's not a character for whom at least in my opinion, right, that the reader can just get away with saying, oh, well, she's just a bitch, like that's not what we're given by the story. We're given a complex, rounded, perhaps strange character, but strange in a compelling way.
Right.
Presenting it in this way and presenting it alongside this question of what is monstrous, like it's not a neutral question, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, the whole book is kind of like that question hovers through the whole book. And I think it's also like the idea of when and why do we ask this question sometimes, For example, in the case of Magos, she's definitely more in like people's eyes because she is a woman, I think. So I was surprised once. So someone asked me about Magos, if I had like written her as like in the trend of like difficult women in literature, or I don't remember the exact words the person asked, but it's like this trend of like My Year of Rest and Relaxation and all of these female characters that kind of like don't subscribe to like the good or like quote unquote good woman or whatever, or like just like unhinged female characters. So that was interesting to me to be asked this question because it made me think like they wouldn't ask, like if Magos was the man, if Magos was Joseph, for example, I don't think I would have gotten that question. Because I think when we talk about like straight male characters or like male characters in general, we don't tend to put them into trends, quote unquote, but because we're not used to like a diversity in like female characters or queer characters or characters of color, especially, we tend to like think they're trends or like there's like a new way to write them. But it's really just like writing people how you like people as people. And when they're rounded, they're gonna be unexpected. And when they're unexpected, maybe they seem unhinged. But I don't think Magos is unhinged. I think she's in a bunker situation. And I think a lot of what she does is maybe not like the ideal standard of goodness. But I think she also acts, yes, with a lot of like self-regard. Like she's like looking out for herself.
And how dare she?
Yeah. But like a lot of us do that. And I think there's also like a strength in like actually like considering yourself in the world and like seeing what you need in the world. And that was very interesting. That's why I like Mago so much, because she also kind of like, she thinks a lot about herself and what she wants in the world and kind of like goes and gets it, even though like it's selfish. But there's also like something interesting in that and something that is powerful to me. And so, yeah, I think all these things about, like what monstrous is, I think like a lot of people would say like Magos is the most monstrous of, and I think I've heard someone said that like Magos is the most monstrous character in the book. And that's okay. Like people will have like, everybody will have like their ranking maybe, or like their opinions. But that's exactly what what the book is trying to do. It's like, can you actually assign that label to someone? And can you actually, like, who gives anybody the right to judge somebody else in that way?
Yeah. So the ending of this book made me think of like a couple of different things.
Yeah.
So one thing you've talked about before is sort of the possibility of this book being read as a queer allegory. And I think that reading is definitely there. And I think it's very compelling. It was reminding me a lot of, I think this was in 2019. I went to AWP and I got to see, Garth Greenwell do a panel on, it was Garth Greenwell, Alexander Chee, Lydia Yuknovich,
and Carmen Maria Machado.
Yes.
Yes, I saw that panel too.
Yes. Okay. So then you know what I'm going to like. Garth Greenwell gave a reading of this essay that was about being monstrous, being seen as monstrous, and sort of like not, I feel like I wish I could remember it because I haven't been able to find a transcript or this essay published anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But what my memory was of him talking about, okay, the world is saying that your desires are monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
And what if they are? And what if so what?
Yeah.
And I thought that was just such an amazing thing. And I feel like it ties in really nicely, really well with what this book is doing with Monstrilio's arc of starting as sort of this amorphous, blobby figure with an armtail, becoming a boy and then a young man, and then sort of returning, one might say regressing, but I don't think that's quite the right word, like returning, accepting oneself.
Right.
Right. So that's part one of what the ending of the book made me think about, and how all of the people in his family that are close to him are so accepting of him doing this, right? Of him just returning to his natural state.
Right.
But also something that really struck me too is because of course this book is so much about grief, because the book opens like, boom, you're like really hit in the face with how terrible this image of the death of this child is, right? It's the first thing that you're given in this book. And the grief is so palpable throughout the book, but especially in the first part, where you see Magos's sort of more, well, one could call it unhinged. But like, let's, say maybe it's not, right? Or the sort of more traditional way that Joseph processes his grief.
Right, right.
And there is this way in which everybody throughout the book is hanging on to this. And in part, I think, because M. Monstrilio is present for them, like physically part of their lives still. And that one of the things I found so interesting, sort of leaving aside the question of whether Joseph and Peter should get married, whether or not that's like a healthy thing for them to do, right? Given the state of their relationship, leaving that question aside. But the fact that they don't quite get married, right? Because like right before the book ends right before their wedding, the night before they're supposed to get married. And it is Monstrilio returning to himself and leaving that ends the book.
Right.
And yet you still have these things in the book that are pointing to that this story is going to continue after.
Right.
And that it is perhaps M's leaving that allows these other characters to finally move on with their lives. Right. I found both of these things, these readings of like the potential for this to be a queer allegory, but also this way in which the structure of grief and how we hold on to it and where it lives in our body and how it affects us, how it turns us into a different person, possibly a monstrous figure.
Right.
Such an interesting thing. Yeah. And I just wanted to sort of see what you thought about that.
Well, I think like in the end, it turns out to be both, at least to me, both this like queer like allegory and also like this grieving part. And I think there's also like in queerness, there's a lot of grieving too. I mean, I don't want to like, because when we grow up, like most of us that are queer didn't grow up like thinking or like accepting ourselves right away. Because like our surroundings, like queerness is not always accepted. I mean, I grew up in Mexico, and even though my family is quite accepting, but it still wasn't like something like you talked about, like, oh, you know, like if you grow up and you're like homosexual or whatever, that's okay. Like those conversations never happened. It was more like just like when I came out, they were accepting, but it wasn't like before. And the society around me, it wasn't like everybody was just like, oh yeah, like queerness is okay and we're all gonna live happily ever after. It's just, you know, it was just like something that you kind of like had to like come to terms with yourself and like kind of like just like understand that you're going to go against the current, you know, you're going to go against the grain and you're gonna like have to like kind of like fight for your identity. And so like a part of you that existed carefree in the world where you could just be like yourself as a kid kind of like goes away, and you grieve for it. You grieve for that part that cannot exist as freely as it did before, because now you're different. you come to that realization, and also you come to the realization that some of your relationships will change, even if you don't want them to, even if they shouldn't. Some of them will, and some people won't accept you, and some people will look at you funny, and maybe they'll come around to looking at you in like a different light. But so I feel like when you're queer, there's a lot of grieving going on, and also with those around you, like the they had of of who you were or who you are kind of changes. And so for them, for some people especially, like maybe that have a harder time like accepting queerness, or like had seen you in like a particular way, they kind of like also grieve for who you were. And so there's loss in that. Obviously it's loss towards something that is, I like to think that is better for you, because it's accepting who you are and like kind of like living your true self, but the loss is still there. And so those two things kind of like exist for me, in queerness and in accepting who you are. In accepting who you are, you also kind of like lose a lot of things, because who you are leaves a lot of other things out. And so yeah, it's kind of like that overlapping journey for me.
That's beautiful. I hadn't really thought about those two things intersecting in quite that way, but it makes a lot of sense. Why don't we take a quick little break, and then we come back and do the second segment?
Absolutely.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about narrative and kind of like what we were talking about before, and how like stories are constructed and like this intersection. So like in the art form that I'm like working on, or like what we're talking about, like literature and like writing, narrative plays a very important part. And narrative also like understanding like there's like a sequence of events, or like there's like some sort of plot to it, and linking that to like how I engage with literature as art, and how I engage with literature as entertainment, and like that kind of like in between, or like overlapping. And I've been thinking a lot about that, because there's certainly like a capitalistic industry part to writing a book. You publish something so that people can buy it, and if it's entertaining and if it's appealing in that way, like it can help you earn money and like sustain yourself. And then, but the other part is like, maybe you just want to do like a super weird, quote unquote, artistic book that's like almost impenetrable for you, and like maybe like a niche of people. And there's no commerce to it, but there's like a sense that that's more art in a way. I'm kind of like stuck in between the two worlds, just like personally thinking, like when I was younger, I always thought like I was more in that like I'm an artist with like capital letters type thing, which is like the more obscure something is, like the better it is, which is like just like a silly way of looking at things. But also going to the other part where you just like produce materials or text just for the sake of selling and just for the sake of commerce feels very unsatisfactory to me. But also like you kind of want to engage people and like have people like enjoy what you've done. And so that's where my mind is at, and how to like bridge the two, or even like questions like the eternal question of what makes art, you know?
Yeah.
Even if that's even relevant a question at all. And so, yeah, I think I said a lot of, post a lot of topics, but
yeah. I mean, I think that this is something that as an artist, someone who's trying to make things, is something that you kind of can't really fully get away from ever. I mean, maybe if you are one of these like really sort of household name, really top tier elite artists who doesn't have to think about money anymore, then maybe. But I think for most of us, you're going to have this question, and it's just going to be running through your creative career. Right. Even the fact that we call it a career, right?
Right, exactly.
I think that this is actually especially true for certain kinds of artists where there is more of, where the art form that you're working in has more of this sort of commercial aspect or overlap to it. So fiction writers are going to have more of this sort of friction between this than perhaps poets. Cause like, you know, I've talked to so many poets, and like one of the things that poets are always talking about is how nobody reads poetry. And you can't really make a living as a poet, right?
Right.
And on the more visual side of things, you know, if you compare like narrative filmmaking as compared to, I don't know, documentary filmmaking or photography, right? Like still visual art is less commercial than film, right?
Right.
So, I mean, there's the opportunity to say, well, like, is a painter more of a pure artist than a filmmaker? I mean, that just seems like silly when you pose it that way.
Yeah.
But the question of how you let that influence what you do is, I think, a really relevant one, because, I mean, even if one were to completely not care about the financial side of it, right? Which I don't think, living in the world we do, that anybody can really fully get away from that. But even if you were, there's just the fact that most of us who are artists, we make our work because we want the work to do something in the world. We want it to live in the world and to be connected with, you know, audiences, right? That we want audiences to experience and connect with our work. And if nobody sees it, if nobody reads it, then did we even do anything, kind of thing, you know?
Right.
So this idea of like, you know, to what extent am I going to be like making something that's obscure and weird, and to what extent am I going to be making something that's accessible and entertaining?
Right.
I think that's something that we all have to reckon with on some level, you know?
Yeah. And like this idea of like art has to be like unconstrained from like boundaries or certain limitations. It's a weird one, and I wonder when it started, because like or this like romantic idea of like the artist like being free from like, you know, like a lot of things and just like expressing something that is like very ethereal or unconstrained. But then a lot of the art that we consider like high art, like in the Renaissance, it came because the church wanted a lot of things done for the church. And so it was like very constrained in what.
Or rich patrons.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of rich patrons. And there were just like a few people that were kind of like allowed, even like economically, to produce art. And who those people were, like kind of like fit into certain categories. But within all those restrictions, there's still a lot of beauty in there. And I wonder if like faced with all these restrictions, like for example, if someone were to tell you like, which in a way, like being a fiction writer, you are being told to write in a certain way. So, I wonder if like working within restrictions also kind of allows for a lot of beauty to happen in a way.
Yeah. I think that this idea of working within constraints is one that it sort of requires a certain amount of extra creativity to say, well, I want to do this, but I don't know. I mean, just to take something that's sort of like what the sort of Oulipo kind of idea of like, I'm going to write a poem, but it can't have any E's in it, you know, like, I mean, that's kind of a silly example.
Right.
But it does require you to, you know, in order to meet that constraint, you have to be sort of extra creative in ways that you might not otherwise be. I think another thing too is this idea of the unencumbered artist really sort of plays towards this idea of the sort of lone genius that we conceive of the artist being, the great artist, right?
Yeah.
Whereas something that I often think about, especially in terms of genre fiction, is how art is not really the product of just like one single genius, but that like even the lone genius is a product of the community that they live in, the world that they live in, that a lot more goes into it than just that. And I feel like that working within a genre makes that a lot more explicit because of the fact that the work is inherently in conversation with other works that are also part of that genre. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we don't exist in a vacuum. And so, yeah, we are all products of our time and our place and our surroundings, immediate and not. And so, yeah, I totally see that as well. Even the language, I mean, so if we write in a language, we're using tools that are not inherently our own or that we didn't create, right? So if we write in English, for example, we take all of what English means and who can read English and all of that. It's also part of our process. Or like if we paint, we're also part of like who produces paints or what kind of paints are being produced, or like, the material things that go into producing something, which is really interesting too.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of the language aspect. I think, when you're talking about this idea of, potentially, having to perhaps compromise your own artistic vision in order to meet the demands of the marketplace, in a lot of ways, I feel like that, not to say that it's a completely false dichotomy, because there are ways that, especially if one's personal artistic vision is very outside the mainstream, that can,
right.
There may have to be some compromise made. But I feel like, I actually feel like, your book here is a really interesting example of how they need not be at odds with each other, because of the fact that you are working not necessarily directly in a very popular genre, but like that you are working with it, right?
Right.
And that you are able to utilize some of these tropes that are found in a genre that is commonly thought of as being purely entertainment and not artistic, and that you can nevertheless still use it to create an aesthetic response in the reader, to create an emotional response, to create an intellectual response, just in the same way that any quote unquote great art does, right? That I feel like, especially now when we're so willing as a culture to reevaluate what we think of things like genre or pop music or things like that, right? Where we're not necessarily saying, pop music, it's just garbage, right? Well, actually, no, we're actually reckoning with maybe it's not garbage. Maybe there's like actually real value to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe there's not as much of a need anymore to separate these things, but I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of separation between these things happen also just because some people have the need to feel exclusive in their tastes sometimes. And so if something's popular, which is like pop culture, I mean, that's where the name comes from, then it can't be exclusive by definition. And so you can't be special, if you like pop music or like pop culture just because everybody else likes it too. But also it's like, is there actual value in like being exclusive or like liking something that only a few other people like? What's the value in that? And I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's like a very genuine response to something that you actually do really like a lot and that like nobody else likes. And that's amazing. But sometimes I feel like it's also like just like a response to not be part of the mainstream. And that's, I don't know, it just, if something is mainstream, then can it be art, or like people start questioning like the value of it. And so that is also very interesting how like we culturally or like as like people react to things like that, right? Once something starts becoming very popular, people start questioning it much, much more.
Yeah. I think that obscurity for the sake of obscurity is just kind of obnoxious.
Right.
And some people definitely do that in a way. Some artists will make their work obscure just in order to make themselves seem smarter, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think that like any technique, that obscurity it need not be an end unto itself, but rather that, making something accessible versus making something obscure provides a different audience experience. And all of these different experiences can be valuable and meaningful.
Right.
But also, I'm now thinking about this in terms of, like I would have used the phrase elitist, but I think that using the phrase exclusive, to me, brings to mind the opposite of exclusivity being inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
And how I wonder how much of this impulse that we are sort of collectively having, certainly in the United States, but I think just globally as well, where in the sort of halls of academia or the sort of taste-making, gatekeeping kind of people in art are being much more inclusive of stuff that would have been considered, garbage before.
Right.
And how much of that has to do with perhaps a changing dynamic between the marginalized groups who were kept on the outside. Like the fact that queer people and women and people of color can suddenly, not suddenly, but like we are perhaps reaching a point where we have more ability to make our voices heard, ability to flex political power or social power, and how much of that plays into this idea, this sort of anti-elitist idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And also exclusivity can also be like a tool of oppression, right? And so there's also power in being exclusive. If you are the one that wields that exclusivity, then you have that power. It just makes me think of the question of what is art and who like gets to decide what is art. And there's also that like exclusive world in which there are certain people that kind of like actually do decide.
Yeah.
And we kind of like just follow along for whatever reason. But yeah, it's very interesting to just like think about the context in which we produce all these things, right?
It is. It's very interesting. We are running up against time, and there's one question that I always like to end with, and that is, if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah, so I watched this movie recently, which is called Petite Maman, which is by Celine Sciamma. She's the director also of Portrait of a Woman on Fire.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Oh, yeah. I love that movie.
Yeah, I love that movie. And so she has this other movie called Petite Maman, which came out, I think, in like 2021, maybe. But it's just so simple. And it has like these fantastical elements, but it's so beautiful. And it's done so well that it just like really moved me. Also because when creating something that has like fantastical elements or like elements that are out of the ordinary, as a creator, there's also like this like burden to kind of like let the audience into this world that you've created and kind of like make them feel that they kind of understand what's going on, or like if they don't understand, at least that they're comfortable enough to like continue exploring and continue questioning. But she does it in such a simple way, like how this world works, that you're just like immediately comfortable, and it's not like complex or anything. And yet it's like, it's beautiful. It's very, and it's also very intimate. I think that's what I said. So yeah, it's a beautiful film. If you can watch it. It's just like a little family story.
Wonderful. I loved Portrait of a Lady on Fire. That was one of my favorite movies that year. So I'm definitely gonna have to check this one out as well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for talking with me as well. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun, and thank you for having me.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase your own copies of Monstrilio. If you enjoyed today's conversation, then I highly recommend it. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back with a new episode soon, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.